Semantics. One would expect that an institution with almost a century of experience of propaganda would have mastered the use of semantics to achieve its aims. How important are semantics in today's journalism? Enough to demonize a routine judicial process? Or maybe even enough to humanize some monstrous murderous ideology? In a recent BBC Breakfast programme, UK Foreign Secretary James Cleverly confronted presenter Sally Nugent, saying, "Hamas, which is a terrorist organisation, I just want to make sure you recognise that in your reporting. These are not militants, these are terrorists." The point to consider is, why did a government minister feel the need to school the BBC on semantics? Maybe it has to do with the BBC's style guide devoted specifically to Israel and the Palestinians. This states that terrorism is a difficult and emotive subject with significant political overtones, and care is required in the use of language that carries value judgments. We should not use the term terrorist without attribution. One could legitimately wonder what further attribution of the undisputedly barbaric attacks committed by Hamas on 7th October in plain sight of the world is still needed to meet the BBC's reporting standards of the term terrorist. For everyone, except the BBC that is, hiding behind sham style guides is sheer hypocrisy, and it is puzzling why the BBC misleads so frequently. It turns out that this habit of casting a colonial overlord gaze on all matters Middle Eastern and South Asian is quite an old malaise. In 2008, the BBC was criticised for referring to the men who carried out the 26/11 Mumbai terrorist attacks, which killed nearly 200 innocent civilians, as gunmen rather than terrorists, the term that is typically used to describe similar attacks in the UK. In protest against the use of the word gunman by the BBC, the famous Indian journalist MJ Akbar refused to take part in the BBC interview after the Mumbai attacks. It turns out that the BBC's imperialist attitude towards India has not escaped the attention of other Western journalists either. Writing for the 2008 edition of the Historical Journal of Film, Radio and Television, Alastair Pinkerton analysed the coverage of India by the BBC from 1947 to 2008. His conclusions are uncompromising. Pinkerton observed a tumultuous history involving allegations of anti-India bias in the BBC's reportage, particularly during the Cold War. He concluded that the BBC's coverage of South Asian geopolitics and economics showed a pervasive and hostile anti-India bias because of its alleged imperialist and neo-colonialist stance.
It seems some sort of psychosis. It seems to have some sort of madness when it comes to Indian Hindus. It's almost as if those in governance at the BBC have set a tone which says, whatever you do to all the producers of news, make sure that you undermine India. That message comes across loud and clear.
The biggest weapon in the arsenal of the BBC against India has always been its documentaries. These have repeatedly provoked the ire of Indians and elicited bans from the Indian government for being biased, incendiary, and far-fetched enough to the point of being completely fake. Take the case of their recent documentary made on the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi, which was almost 2 decades in the making. The documentary was a full-on attack on Prime Minister Modi for an alleged role in the 2002 Gujarat riots, in which the BBC appeared to blame him squarely for the harm inflicted. Now, why would the BBC dig up a painful case after 2 decades, given that Prime Minister Modi, who was the Chief Minister of Gujarat at the time, was thoroughly investigated by the highest court in India and found completely innocent? In fact, in its judgment, the Supreme Court of India not only threw out all allegations against the Prime Minister, but also chastised the petitioners for their far-fetched attempt to keep the pot boiling. Does the sensational sting operation, as described by the architects of the BBC documentary, warrant fresh attention? Especially considering that the two key interviewees, themselves known rioters, openly bragged about being connected to the top echelons and Prime Minister Modi. Well, the sting video evidence had already been thrown out by the Supreme Court, as these key witnesses had confessed to reading out from a script. It turns out that the BBC's sting reporter wanted spicy material and had asked them to make explosive allegations. From the looks of it, there are ample grounds to conclude that the BBC knowingly executed a media hit job on India and Prime Minister Modi, wasting precious public funds on a propaganda project intentionally targeting a friendly, democratically elected sovereign government. And to what end? Perhaps seeking to instigate regime change or incite insurrection amongst its people. The BBC is no stranger to regular criticism for its peculiarly biased documentaries on India. In 2015, a BBC documentary on Delhi's Nirbhaya rape case called India's Daughter by Leslie Udwin sparked global outrage. Here too, the BBC broke all guidelines under which it was permitted to shoot, including a payment of 40,000 rupees made to a convicted rapist to appear in the documentary. Many believe that this non-credible criminal was likely coached on the script, as he stumbled when using words unfamiliar to him, like juvenile for example, language singularly uncharacteristic of an uneducated criminal. Even more appalling was the manner in which the BBC allowed its local partner to sell a horrific crime documentary with a nauseating advertisement stating, "NDTV proudly presents a world premiere interview with a real-life rapist." Did the BBC equate this heinous and gruesome act with some sort of cheap, titillating entertainment? Unsurprisingly, this fact-deficient documentary with its morally questionable style was also banned by the Indian government. Whilst defaming brand India by broadcasting this single case globally, it is noteworthy that the BBC itself was guilty of having a culture where multiple sexual predators were allowed to roam freely whilst abusing children as young as 8 years old. Several investigations have revealed that in the region of 100 children were sexually desecrated by some of the most famous employees of the BBC. More on this willful, blatant and shameful hypocrisy later. It certainly begs the question, how does an organisation with huge public resources and a carefully cultivated public standing repeatedly offend 1 billion plus people with such regularity? Is it by chance? Or could it be by design?
Here's how it works. It's a well-established toolkit. Intellectuals, artists, journalists, authors, editors, and the like from target countries such as India, Russia, Iran, or China are enticed over to the West. There, they're conditioned into becoming supposedly dissident intellectuals who are then weaponized against their home country. Yasha Levine has coined this term, weaponized immigrant, for this sort of pseudo-intellectual immigrant who's then deployed against their homeland. So these types of thinkers and media personalities will often be employed as narrative setters, as editors and journalists, who then play a big role in how news about their homelands is presented to audiences in the West. This also includes a reverse propagandization, as they send Western propaganda back to their homelands with a native face to make it more acceptable. But it's designed to foment dissent and encourage subversive elements in their homelands. So that is essentially the role of many public broadcasters. And that's exactly what the BBC does in India and other post-colonial nations. And this was also standard procedure during the Cold War, when it was perfected by a range of public broadcasters against the countries of the former Soviet bloc, the former Eastern Bloc.
It is undeniable that sometimes BBC's documentaries and reportage has had far-reaching implications for Indians abroad, even on occasion inciting racist physical attacks against them. After the ban of the BBC documentary on the Nubaya rape case, a professor in Leipzig University, reflecting the sentiments of many other female professors in Germany, openly confessed in an email to not accepting any male Indian students for internships because of India's alleged rape problem. Yes, the BBC's insidious and false portrayal made matters difficult for Indian students across Europe and almost created a diplomatic fracas between India and Germany. Speaking of flagrant bias, Baron Lord Inderjit Singh of Wimbledon, commander of the British Empire, who had been a famous voice on the BBC's flagship Today programme for over 35 years, said that the BBC blocked him from even discussing a guru from his own religion. Lord Singh was prevented from speaking of Guru Tegh Bahadur Ji, one of the 10 Sikh gurus who had fought against the violent conversion of Hindus to Islam in 17th century India. Himself a celebrated interfaith activist, Lord Singh hit out at the BBC for its prejudice and intolerance. Despite the episode being based on undisputed historical fact and absent of any criticism of Islam, he was told that the broadcast may have offended Muslims. Despite the BBC loudly proclaiming that we take complaints very seriously, a similar incident of brazen deception caused Rabbi Rubinstein to resign after 30 years of service in the corporation. In this incident, the BBC had claimed without evidence that Islamophobic comments made by Jewish tourists had provoked Muslim violence. Yet, the Metropolitan Police and independent experts who analysed the audio evidence found no anti-Muslim slurs whatsoever. But even that did not deter the BBC's own Executive Complaints Unit from practically exonerating its colleagues, despite all the independent findings to the contrary. Rabbi Rubinstein wrote in an open letter, "I simply don't see how I, or in fact any Jew, who has any pride in that name, can be associated with the corporation anymore." Now, some may argue that these are cases of cautious political correctness stretched to the extreme and not really BBC mischief. Until you discover that the same BBC screened a 10-part podcast entitled "I Am Not a Monster" on the jihadi ISIS bride Shamima Begum. This documentary retraced her journey to Syria and then proceeded to follow this up with a further 90-minute program called The Shamima Begum Story. Perhaps it escaped the BBC's attention that victims of ISIS, as well as families of British servicemen, might have been hurt by the degree of biased contextualization and generous consideration given in these broadcasts to what can only be described as plainly heinous terror crimes. This raises yet another crucial and vexing question about the BBC: the consistent platforming and the kid gloves treatment accorded to Islamist extremists. Here, it is not just Shamima Begum who received red carpet treatment and global exposure. The world was witness to how the national British broadcaster whitewashed the Al-Qaeda and ISIS supporter Majid Freeman as a community activist during its reporting of the attacks against Hindus in Leicester, UK in November 2022. Whilst elevating such anti-Hindu voices, the BBC carefully avoided mention of multiple high-impact Islamist Twitter handles which had actively fueled violence with provably fake anti-Hindu propaganda. In fact, the BBC in one report could not summon up enough courage to call out the Islamists by name, but instead coyly described them as a particular small South Asian community allegedly with conservative views. Yet the same oversensitivity vanished completely when talking about Hindus, where the BBC went out of its way to falsely and comically insinuate that it was they who started the rioting. Against themselves, that is. The BBC's reporting went so far as to repeatedly use the term Hindutva as an anti-Hindu racist dog whistle, when in reality Hindutva is a term that literally means Hindu-ness. In one of its Leicester reports, The BBC talked of analysing 200,000 tweets in English that used certain hashtags about Hindus being under attack and claimed that over 50% of these tweets came from India. They then described this as a manipulation of the hashtags, insinuating that the Hindu support from India somehow worsened the violence in Leicester. Imagine the travesty. The BBC was concerned that the Hindu victims of Leicester were being supported by their own Hindu community, a majority of whom lived in their ancestral Hindu homeland of India. Meanwhile, we still await the BBC's analysis of substantial tweets which originated from Islamic states such as Iran and Pakistan, as disclosed by the independent Network Contagion Research Institute of USA. And if this isn't evidence of the BBC's stark anti-Hindu, pro-Muslim discrimination, then one can legitimately ask, what is?
Especially when it comes to Indian issues or the Indian subcontinent, or when it comes to Hindu issues or Indic issues, meaning Hindus, Sikhs, Jains and Buddhists. When it comes to any of issues like that, they'll say what they want to. You question them and they will have no verifiable evidence, no research, nothing to support their case. Because they've got nothing to support their case, they run away and they hide behind the chart. That's been a consistent pattern.
I stopped paying for my TV license 2.5 years ago precisely because of this. I want the BBC to recognise the responsibility that they have to ensure that their reporting is accurate, it's non-biased, and it doesn't divide communities, which is exactly what they're doing. We need a change and we need it now.
The pro-Muslim, anti-Hindu documentary on Prime Minister Modi spectacularly drew the ire of even Muslim intellectuals. Prime amongst them, Tariq Mansour, Vice-Chancellor of Aligarh Muslim University, who pointed out, the BBC could check how many Islamic nations have bestowed their highest honour on Prime Minister Modi. Actually, the feedback that the BBC should frame in its hallowed editorial halls is that from Mansour, who warns the BBC to keep their nefarious agenda away from Muslims. Our community has had enough false godparents who have merely used Muslim issues to build their brands. In a damning piece, Tariq Mansour writes, the phrase white man's burden is well known. It signifies the responsibility forcibly taken on by white aristocratic men to make the world a better place. But equally worrying today is the white media's burden, the self-acquired responsibility of the Western media to create false and illogical discourse around those who are either far from their universe or those they are heavily biased against. The recent BBC series The Modi Question is a perfect example of the white media's burden. It is an unwanted and unsubstantiated commentary on a subject that they are prejudiced against. The mindless targeting of the Prime Minister of the world's largest democracy fails several tests.